I was wondering where to record, and I fancied getting out of England. So I asked my record label, which is EMI, to supply me with a list of all the studios they had around the world. I've written songs that followed me for more than 60 years. Some became bigger than any of us expected. Some still surprise me when I hear them coming out of a radio somewhere. But every songwriter knows a feeling we don't talk about very often. You hear somebody else's song, and for a moment you're jealous. Not in a nasty way. You're jealous because they found something you were looking for. John and I used to have that feeling. A new record would arrive, we'd put it on, and suddenly the room would go quiet. Then one of us would look at the other as if to say, right, we've got some work to do. That was the wonderful thing about those days. Elvis could frighten you. Brian Wilson could astonish you. An old song your father loved could suddenly teach you more about melody than something recorded yesterday. And sometimes the greatest lesson came from the bloke sitting beside you. So when people ask me about the greatest songs ever written, I can't really give them a scientific answer. Songs don't work like that. I can only tell you which ones stayed with me, which ones made me listen again, which ones made me wish just a little bit that my name had been on the label. There are 5 I want to talk about, and the last one might surprise you because it takes me back beyond the Beatles, beyond rock and roll, beyond all the noise that came afterward. But first, I want to start with a song by a man people once insisted was our rival. I never really heard it that way. When I heard what Brian Wilson had done, I simply thought, bloody hell, that's beautiful. Brian Wilson frightened us a little. I mean that as a compliment. There was always this story about the Beatles and the Beach Boys competing with one another, and people liked that idea. Britain against America. Brian makes a great record, we make one, then he comes back with something else. But when I heard God Only Knows, I wasn't thinking about competition. I was listening to the chords. They seemed to move somewhere you didn't expect, yet somehow they always landed exactly where they should. And then there was that melody. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I keep coming, that's the word I keep coming back to. When Pet Sounds arrived, I listened very carefully. We all did. Brian was showing what could happen when you stopped treating a pop record as something disposable. You could build a whole world inside it. And God Only Knows was the moment that really got me. There's tenderness in it, but it never becomes sentimental. There's sophistication, but you don't have to understand any of the theory to feel it. That's terribly difficult to do. As a songwriter, you can sometimes become too clever. You find an unusual chord and think, oh, that's good. But the listener shouldn't be sitting there admiring your chord. They should be feeling something. Brian understood that. I've spoken over the years about how much that song means to me, and I still find it tremendously moving because beneath all that beautiful production, it has the thing every great song needs, a heart. And whenever I hear it, I'm reminded of something important. The people who push you the hardest aren't always standing beside you. Sometimes they're thousands of miles away, making a record so good that you have no choice but to go back into the studio and try harder. But the next song goes much further back for me. Before John and I were writing together, before anyone knew my name, there was a voice coming out of America that made the future suddenly sound possible. Before Elvis, the world felt different. That sounds dramatic now, but if you were a young lad in Liverpool in the 1950s, you'll understand what I mean. Then you heard that voice, and suddenly everything shifted. Heartbreak Hotel didn't sound like the polite music we were used to hearing. There was space in it, mystery, loneliness. It sounded dangerous. I remember how important Elvis was to all of us. Um, John loved him, George loved him, I loved him. We didn't just want to listen to those records. We wanted to understand them. How do you make something feel like that? That question eventually sends you toward a guitar. And once you've got the guitar, you start trying a few chords. Then perhaps you write something yourself. That's how these things begin. What I still love about Heartbreak Hotel is that it doesn't need very much. It doesn't throw everything at you. It creates a mood, and then Elvis walks into that mood with that extraordinary voice. As a young musician, you didn't sit there analyzing the production. You just felt it. And that feeling mattered because Elvis made music seem like somewhere you could go. For boys like us in Liverpool, America seemed incredibly far away. Memphis might as well have been another planet. But you could buy a record, you could put the needle down, and suddenly that world was in the room with you. Years later, I actually met Elvis with the other Beatles. Imagine that. The fellow whose records had seemed almost mythical was suddenly sitting there in front of us. But fame does strange things. Eventually you meet your heroes and they become human beings. The record doesn't. The record stays exactly where you first found it. For me, Heartbreak Hotel still contains something of that young boy in Liverpool hearing a door open. And once that door opened, I never really went back. But number 3 is very different because this time I wasn't standing outside the song wondering how it had been made. I was there, and so was John. It's a strange thing talking about one of your own records as a great song. You feel a bit embarrassed. There's something very un-British about sitting there saying, yes, we were brilliant. So I won't do that. But I will tell you what I remember. A Day in the Life felt different while we were making it. John had the beginning. That voice of his had a certain distance to it, almost as if he were observing the world from somewhere slightly outside it. He'd been reading the newspaper, picking up these little fragments of ordinary life. And somehow in John's hands, ordinary things could become rather unsettling. Then I had another piece. It was faster, different mood entirely. That bit about waking up, getting out of bed, rushing through the morning. On paper, you might think those two ideas had no business being in the same song. But that was often how John and I worked. He would bring something, I would bring something. And instead of asking which one should survive sometimes, we'd ask, what happens if we put them together? That's where the fun began. Then came George Martin and the orchestra. We wanted this enormous climb, something that would start almost normally and then become complete chaos. Trying to explain that to a room full of classical musicians was rather amusing, but they did it, and suddenly the song wasn't merely a song anymore. It felt like a journey. What I love when I hear it now is that you can still hear all of us searching. We didn't have a map. Nobody came into the studio knowing exactly what the finished record would sound like. We discovered it as we went along, and perhaps that's why it still feels alive to me. People sometimes imagine the Beatles knew we were making history. We didn't. We were working, trying things, laughing, getting frustrated, coming back the next day and trying again. And somewhere in all of that, John's song and my little section found each other. That's one of the things I miss most about working with him. John could bring you something that made you think differently. He might take a turn you wouldn't have taken, and then you had to answer it, not by copying him, by bringing something of your own. That tension could create something neither of us would have written alone. A Day in the Life reminds me of that. Not just of the Beatles, of John, of George Martin, of being in that studio when there were still possibilities everywhere. And when that final piano chord arrives and hangs there, I can still remember the feeling. We knew we had something. We just didn't know people would still be listening all these years later. Number two, though, takes me back to being a listener again. And it begins with one of the most recognizable sounds ever put on a record. You know it almost immediately. That drum beat, you don't need the title. You don't even need the voice yet. A few seconds and you're already inside the record. That's something I've always admired. Be My Baby has this enormous sound, but underneath it, there's a very simple emotion. Someone wants to be loved. That's it. And sometimes that's enough. When Ronnie Spector's voice comes in, she doesn't sound as though she's performing some grand piece of music. She sounds young, hopeful, a little vulnerable, and that makes the whole thing work. Of course, people talk about Phil Spector and the Wall of Sound. And yes, the production was extraordinary. There's so much happening in there. But the clever thing is that you don't sit there thinking about how many instruments were used. You hear one thing, one complete sound. That fascinated us. When we were making records with George Martin, we were always listening to what other people were doing. Not because we wanted to copy them. You wanted to know what was possible. A record like Be My Baby made you realize the studio itself could become part of the composition. The room mattered. The echo mattered. The way the drums hit you mattered. Everything mattered. But none of it would mean much without the song underneath. That's the lesson. Production can make a good song enormous. It cannot make an empty song immortal. Be My Baby had both a wonderful song and a sound you could recognize from across the room. That's rare. And there's another reason records like that stay with me. They take you somewhere instantly. You hear that opening and suddenly you're not 84. You're young again. You're hearing new records. You're wondering what everyone else is doing. You're excited because music seems to be changing every few months. I still love that feeling. The idea that somebody might walk into a studio tomorrow and discover something none of us has thought of yet. Because that's what keeps music alive. But if you ask me to choose a song that represents something even older than all of this, something beyond rock and roll, beyond production, beyond fashion, I'd have to go back quite a long way, actually, to a melody I've carried with me for years. And that brings me to number one. Now, this one takes us somewhere completely different. Before Elvis, before the Beatles, before any of us started turning amplifiers up and making all that noise. Stardust comes from another world, and perhaps that's why I love it. My dad had music in him. He played piano, and the songs of his generation were around when I was growing up. So although rock and roll came along and completely knocked us sideways, those older melodies never really disappeared. They stayed in there somewhere. And Stardust is one of those songs. Hoagy Carmichael wrote a melody that seems to wander. It doesn't always go where you expect it to go. That's one of the things I admire about it. You listen and think you know where the next note should be. Then it slips somewhere else. But it never feels clever for the sake of being clever. It feels natural. That's the magic. When I was younger, I probably wouldn't have explained it that way. You simply heard a beautiful tune. As you get older and spend your life writing songs, you begin to appreciate just how difficult that simplicity is. Everyone wants the great melody. You sit at a piano, you pick up a guitar, you play around with chords, and Every now and then something arrives that feels as though it had always existed. You wonder whether you actually wrote it or whether you simply found it. The best songs can give you that feeling. Stardust has survived different singers, different arrangements, and different generations because it doesn't depend on any particular fashion. Strip everything away and the melody is still there. That matters to me. I've always loved melody. John did too, although we approached things differently. And when we were writing together, there was always that little test. Could you remember it? Could you go home humming it? Could it survive without all the decoration around it? Because studios change, sounds change. What people consider fashionable changes terribly quickly. A melody doesn't care. If it's good enough, someone can sit at an old piano 50 years later and it still works. That's extraordinary when you think about it. And it's humbling for a songwriter. You can spend your entire life trying to write something that lasts. Then you hear a song written before you were born and realize they'd already figured it out. That's why I come back to Stardust. Not because it's louder than everything else, not because it changed rock and roll. It didn't need to. It reminds me of where songs come from. Before the record business, before the charts, before anyone starts worrying about whether something will be a hit, there is simply someone, a piano, and a melody worth remembering. After all these years, I think that may be the hardest thing of all to achieve. So there you are, 5 songs. And tomorrow you could ask me again and I might give you 5 different ones. That's the trouble with music. There's too much of it to love. I've been unbelievably lucky. I got to hear Elvis when everything still felt new. I watched Brian Wilson take pop music somewhere beautiful. I stood beside John while we tried to make something neither of us could have made alone. And I heard records like Be My Baby remind everyone just how powerful 3 minutes could be. But eventually you stop thinking about who sold the most records. You stop worrying about who was number one. Those things seemed terribly important when we were young. They don't seem quite so important now. What matters is whether the song remains, whether somebody who wasn't even born when you wrote it can hear it decades later and feel something. That's the miracle, really. The musicians get older. The studios disappear. The world changes. But somehow the songs stay.